What is up, everybody? I'm NoLuxGiven here with your afternoon snap, and today, instead of looking at the most exciting deck, I'm potentially going to be doing the opposite and taking a look at a really boring deck, or at least a deck that you've probably already seen before. This deck has been around forever. In fact, it was the first deck that I ever hit Infinite with over a year ago in September of 2022. And part of the reason I'm making this video is this deck still works. I played it for the Win for Spectrum Games weekend mission, and I won every single one of my games and hit Infinite with it. I did change one card in the deck. As you can see, I'm not playing Captain America. Instead, I am playing Mobius. It's another 3/3 with ongoing. I figured I'd try it out. Captain America probably actually better. I was thinking about playing Mobius here because I think that Medusa is sometimes seen alongside Wave, but I wanted to play Cosmo into the Nexus regardless, so that way I could play Destroyer into the Nexus. And this is still a pretty good end result of that, getting a huge early lead in a pretty important location there. So I think it all worked out here. And then on turn 5, I'm just going to play Mr. Fantastic and Armor in the center to set up for a big Spectrum. And that's a great way to kick this video off, getting to play both Destroyer and Spectrum, the two linchpins of this deck. Both in the first game. And part of the reason that I think that this deck is cool, if you haven't already heard me talk about it a bunch, is Armor, Cosmo, and Professor X all work very well with Destroyer, and they all have ongoing, so they work with Spectrum. So there's some nice overlap in synergy there. I only take my opponent for 1 cube here, as I never snap and my opponent retreats on the final turn. I was a little bit hesitant to snap because I wasn't feeling super confident about this game in general or this deck. I'm gonna get more confident as these games go on though. But yeah, I was just really impressed with this deck overall. I think that the games went pretty well for me. This game was a little bit awkward because I didn't draw any of my 1 or 2 cost cards to open up the game. I've got 5 of them, Ant-Man, and then 4 different 2 cost cards. Didn't draw any, but that's okay. We are still able to make it work in this one. Clintar is an awkward center location for the start of the game, so I'm gonna play into Eternity range here to kick things off and just double Cosmo in both of those side locations, which I think works out pretty nicely for me. And then the other thing that we get to do here, and I actually will start to get a little bit of that confidence that I was talking about, I'm going to snap on turn 4 basically, as I realize that Warpath works really well with Clintar. 2 cards in this deck were recently buffed, Spectrum and Warpath. And Warpath, in theory, is good into Clintar because it'll play as a 4/10, and then it'll turn into a symbiote, and it will lock in that 10 power, even if you play cards to other lanes. Now, my opponent floods the center location, so we're not really going to get to see that in action here, and I'm thinking about playing Mr. Fantastic center before the location shuts down. But I think there's probably a better play here, which is to just flood that flooding location with some cheaper cards that I've since drawn since the start of the game. Then on the final turn of the game, I will get to play Destroyer, and hopefully that's enough power to win one of these 2 lanes on the side. My opponent does have Daredevil Sight on the 5th turn, so they could potentially make things awkward here with like a Professor X to shut down one of these locations, but they won't be able to Alioth me on the final turn of the game because one of these locations is nowhere and the other location is shut down for Cosmo. I'm kind of double protecting the center location, both with the nowhere / Cosmo, and then also Armor is just going to protect it. Now, my opponent knows they can't win in the center, but still their best play is to play to the center with that Mrs. Marvel. We can see these locations were pretty awkward for my opponent this game. They probably drew Storm on turn 4. Didn't want to play Mr. Fantastic there because of Clintar, and then they drew Mrs. Marvel off curve, and you still kind of have to play that card in the center location. So it's a little bit awkward for them, and then I'm just going to finish this game off with Destroyer. Two reasonable options for where to play it, but I do think it's probably best to just play it where I already have, or not as big of a power differential, losing by 4 as opposed to losing by 7. My opponent would have to contribute 11 power to Eternity range to still lose. They'd need 12 to beat me because they would lose in a tie scenario. So it's going to be pretty tricky for them to come up with enough stats to take me out here, and we will see that ultimately they will not. I was zooming in on the Rock to see, just remind myself that the Rock is a 1 cost card, and that could potentially be throwing off some Mrs. Marvel math that my opponent has to try to come up with now, because it's tricky for them to come up with 11 power out of like what's probably a Spectrum sort of ongoing deck, maybe Alioth, I'm not sure. They aren't able to come up with it, and we take them there for 4 cubes. Let's take a look at another one here, and I'm not sure, you know what, I probably shouldn't have skipped ahead. At the end of this one, I will showcase like the rank up part of it so you can see where I was ranked. But if you watched my last video, you'll know that I was like almost infinite when Project Pegasus went away, and this was what finally put me over the hump, just playing some games with Spectrum. I decided ultimately to not play Ant-Man on turn 1 of this game. It's a flexible, cheap enough card that a lot of times you don't have to run it out there until you know what the locations are and what your plan is for the game. And this game, we're gonna have our entire plan mapped out here on turn 2 with Lamentis 1 showing us, okay, these are the 7 cards that we have to work with. So kind of a fun one here. You don't get to play with Lamentis 1 super often, but I'm feeling confident with Lizard into Shuri's Lab. I've got Professor X and Armor to protect against Destroyer. So I feel like we've got a lot of powerful cards to do some work with. I'm going to kick things off, like I said, with that Lizard into Shuri's Lab. On turn 3, my opponent snaps us back, but I'm still going to stay in it. Like I said, I feel confident with the tools that we have at our disposal here, and I'm just going to play Mobius into Shuri's Lab this turn. Nothing super crazy again. Probably would have been better as a Captain America, though maybe my Mobius is stopping something that my opponent would like to do this game. We'll see that in just a moment. Some hate cards like Mobius are a little bit tough to see the full value of when you don't have the full picture of what your opponent is hanging on to in their hand. And then on turn 4, I realize I can get a little bit spicy with it. I can play Warpath into Hala, which is a bunch of power on turn 4. Like I said, Warpath was just buffed to 10. It's gonna mean my opponent would have to play 8 power into Hala to not have their Sunspot and whatever else they play explode this turn. Now, turns out they're just gonna play a Magic, so they're gonna completely get rid of Hala, so Warpath doesn't really get to do everything I want it to do. But this turn, I think I still have a nice play of Professor X into Shuri's Lab. They might play into Shuri's Lab this turn, but I feel like we still have a decent amount of power there. Maybe could have played the Professor into Lamentis 1, but I didn't really want to turn off Warpath just yet. So I decided to play Professor into Shuri's Lab. It turns out my opponent has a Leech for me, which is pretty good. Leech in a Lamentis 1 game, typically. However, this game it's not going to do that much. It turns off the Destroyer, which is good. Turning off the Armor and the Destroyer at the same time basically just cancel each other out here. So really all my opponent did was sap 3 power out of Ant-Man. I play Ant-Man and Armor into Warpath this turn. I realized I could have actually declined to play the Ant-Man again and just played that on the 7th turn of the game, held on to a little bit more information about it. But ultimately, I think this is fine here. It's not going to be too big of a deal. And I actually have 2 potential plays here still. I could play Destroyer into Lamentis 1 or into Limbo. I think it's probably better to just play it into Limbo because I will lose 5 power off my Warpath by playing it into Lamentis, which means I'm then losing in Limbo. I am kind of expecting my opponent to battle for Limbo this turn. And what I should have done here is I should have just played into Limbo because my opponent could have actually beaten me this game with Jeff, the baby land shark. Jeff into Shuri's Lab plus just a little bit of power in Limbo, or even no power in Limbo. Just Jeff into Shuri's Lab. I would have lost the game. But they don't have it. They play a pair of Cosmos and I'm able to take them for 8 cubes. So take a look at this victory screen here to see that that puts me up to 99.2. Just 5 cubes away from hitting infinite. You can still play this deck if you need to complete your Spectrum missions, and I'll also show the deck that I use to complete my Captain Marvel missions. I don't have a Mrs. Marvel deck because I'm free to play, but I'll showcase that deck as well in just a moment, and then after that, we'll take a look at the final game where I actually get infinite. But I just thought this was a kind of a cool video because it's not really a deck that is on my radar or has been on my radar for a little bit, but can definitely still get it done. I think that it is still as sweet of a deck as ever because you have the threat of both Spectrum and Destroyer, which both kind of attack from interesting different angles. One powers up locations you've already filled, and one just throws a bunch of power in another location. By the way, got super lucky this game to throw an armor down in a location where my opponent played X-23 and Deadpool, presumably to set up for a huge Venom. But yeah, that worked out really well for me. Turn 3, I'm going to drop Mr. Fantastic into the center location. That'll work pretty well with Negative Zone. And then Professor X plus Spectrum should probably be able to win another location. So I'm going to snap Professor X plus Spectrum. Didn't really talk about that synergy other than the fact that Professor X is ongoing, but it basically does the same job that I was talking about earlier in terms of filling a location. In that nobody else can play there once Professor X is in there, but you can still contribute more power via Spectrum. So that is still as good as it always has been, and is definitely just makes this deck a solid contender. I draw Colossus on turn 4, which is a fantastic draw. Mojo into Nidavellir is really powerful, and then Colossus into Negative Zone. The locations just line up super well for me, and I can even Spectrum into Kamartaj. So I could not ask for better locations on this one. Of course, we are going to try to make it an 8-cube game here. X-23 lands into Nidavellir, and then the other one just lands back into Kamartaj for Carnage to eat it again, which was a really sweet turn for my opponent. But now I will get to flip over a Professor X, and that's probably going to make things pretty difficult for them. And what I'm actually thinking of doing here is just playing Professor X into Negative Zone, and then leaving that center location open for me to drop Spectrum on the final turn of the game. There's definitely a lot of different ways that you could play it though. Could go Warpath center, could just go Professor X center, and then Spectrum into the Kamartaj. But ultimately, I think that this is the safest play. It'll lock my opponent out of the Negative Zone as well. And by the looks of it, it's basically going to be locking my opponent out of the game. I'm expecting this last card in Kamartaj to blow some things up, but they are kind of locked down in an awkward way in Nidavellir because of armor, and that's going to be enough for my opponent to retreat. So with 4 cubes, that's going to put me to 99.6, and I'll be back in a second with live commentary for the game that got me infinite. Real quick, I figured I'd showcase the Captain Marvel list that I used to get 4 wins as well. Nothing super crazy, just a Zabu deck with some cards that I think are good right now. Super Scroll and Enchantress, Typhoid Mary, kind of like a combo with Enchantress there. Probably should also have Luke Cage in the deck instead of either Jeff or Silk. Probably don't need both of those and Captain Marvel. So those are some changes that I would make. And then I'd potentially also play Storm just because it's so good with all of those movement cards, and it's really good with Legion. And Cosmo and Juggernaut are kind of in there to mess with people doing Mrs. Marvel shenanigans. They can also disrupt Alioth. which I think is an important factor to have in your deck, and then there's Rock Slide plus Darkhawk so that you can actually win some games and throw some power onto the board. Pretty straightforward deck, just figured I'd showcase it real quick, and it's not optimal, but it got me 4 wins. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to structure this video, but now I'm going to showcase the game that got me to Infinite. Remember, I only need 1 cube, and I decided to record this one with live commentary because I figured I was probably going to hit Infinite. So here you go, that is how we will finish it up. Mojo into Mojo World makes a heck of a lot of sense. And then I'll probably just try to armor this location. Mini Lab might make things a little bit tricky. Only really need to play for 1 cube here, so there's really no sense in me snapping at all, other than to bully my opponent off of the location. A little bit of lag there, but we are looking good. And yeah, I'm not sure what order I'm going to present all of this stuff in. Feel like I should just play Destroyer into Mini Lab on the final turn of the game. I do have an interesting opportunity here to grab a pair of Hulks, which is kind of exciting. I feel like you should take the shot at the pair of Hulks while you can. It's just going to be so hard for my opponent to beat me in Mojo World. I'm going to grab the pair of Hulks, though. Let's snap. That might bully my opponent off of this and just get me the cube. They see Mojo. They know we can dump. They might be expecting that we're just going to take over in Gamma Lab here. Armor and Cosmo can both protect me from Shang-Chi. And it looks like it is going to be a little bit of a hazmat sort of deck. That's what I would imagine here. Cosmo has an interesting opportunity to stop my opponent from effectively using Hazmat, but I would have to guess where they're going to play at this turn. I think that this is safer. This is if I want to drop Destroyer. This is if I want to drop Spectrum. But I might just play Armor into Gamma Lab next turn as well, alongside Lizard or Mr. Fantastic or Mobius. Let's play Cosmo here. See if we catch it. Yeah, they are more likely to play the Hazmat here if they get it. That's just going to be a naked Absorbing Man. I do find Mobius. So now I could do something like this. Actually... So now the option is I do this and I play Destroyer here. Okay, they retreat. I get 2 cubes. Don't even have to think about it. I had a lot of lines this game. That's why I really like this deck. I think that this game showcased it well. My commentary was a little bit all over the place, and my camera's also a little big here. I was showcasing Lily for a moment, but we are going to be able to grab 2 cubes there, and with that we'll grow into infinite rank for the season with a pretty classic deck. That's why I thought this was kind of like a fun video to put out. I was just playing Spectrum for the... Yeah, this will go at the end of the video. It's a little too chaotic to start the video off with, but there we go. I've already probably said everything else that I need to say here with that. So with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I'll claim my end of season, probably card back or something. Cool. And with that, that's going to be it for me today. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm No Lex Given. Peace.